Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Adolfo Kaminsky, A Forger's Life, by Sarah Kaminsky, translated by Mike Mitchell, narrated by Simon Vance. Preface. When I was little, I knew nothing about the story of my father's life. I was the youngest of 3 children. As far as I could see, I had a father like everyone else's, who always taught me to obey the law. At home he never talked about his earlier life, when he'd been a forger. There was one episode, however, that should have made me think. One day I got a poor grade at school. I was absolutely determined to conceal it from my parents. I decided to forge my mother's signature. I'd never have dared to try and copy my father's. It's absolutely impossible to forge. I practiced for a long time on draft paper before setting about it carefully. Later on, my mother happened to come across my notebook and immediately realized that the signature was forged. I really got yelled at. Ashamed of myself, I took refuge in my bed. When my father arrived home from work, he came to my bedroom. Expecting the worst, to be hauled over the coals as never before, I hid under the blankets. He sat down on the side of the bed, my notebook in his hand, and simply burst out laughing. He laughed so much he couldn't stop. Puzzled, I poked my head out of the sheets. Looking at me with a big smile on his face, he declared, "But at least you could have made it a better one, Sarah. Look at this signature. How tiny it is." Then he went away, laughing uproariously. I couldn't say precisely when I knew. There was never a family gathering at which our father announced, "Children, I have something important to tell you." It just happened as time passed. When I was very young, I liked to keep my ears pricked to hear what the grown-ups were talking about. I heard it said that he'd been in the Second World War, the Algerian War. But to my little girl's mind, being in the war meant to be a soldier. I found it difficult to imagine my father, a pacifist and non-violent, with a helmet and rifle. Later on, books were published in which his name was mentioned. Then there were documentaries in which he agreed to speak. Eventually, once I was grown up, I naively thought I knew more or less everything there was to know. I couldn't imagine it would take me several years to gather together and compile all the elements of his biography. There were so many memories to be called up, people to be found, places to be visited. A lot of travel was needed to find my father's former comrades. The ones I wanted to question were scattered all over the world. One was in Portugal, another in Algeria, yet others in Israel, in Switzerland, in Italy, in the United States, in Latin America. Some were missing, already deceased. It was a matter of urgency to collect as many accounts as possible before there were no more witnesses left. I realized that time had suddenly started to fly. My father was no longer young. He was about to celebrate his 78th birthday. I was 24, and I just had my son Alec. All this triggered something in my mind. For the first time I realized my father wasn't immortal. The birth of Alec brought its share of joy and wonder, but also this fear. Was Alec going to have the time to get to know his grandfather? If that didn't happen, would it be up to me to tell him the story of that remarkable life? Alec was babbling away in his stroller when I walked to my father's to ask him if he would like me to write the book. He gave his approval immediately. When I was back home, he called me. There was one question bothering him. "Sarah, do you know if there's a statute of limitation?" It was the first thing he wanted to know. Did he still risk going to prison, despite the thousands of lives he'd saved? For every time he'd gone to the aid of an oppressed people, he had been breaking the law. At best, he risked being sent to prison for his commitment to these causes, at worst, condemned to death. And that explains why it took so many years for him to agree to reveal his secrets. We arranged to see each other every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. I warned him, "You'll have to answer all my questions, even those that will take you back to past events that are painful. Are you really sure you want to share all that with me?" He agreed enthusiastically. However, the first session turned out to be a disaster. Concerned not to lose the least detail of our conversation, I brought a dictaphone. As soon as I turned it on, my father's voice was transformed. It became hesitant, too low. almost inaudible. He answered my questions with stock replies, or a simple yes, no, it wasn't like that, or mere grunts. At the end of the day, I had no usable information. I told myself we'd never get there. At the next session, I decided not to turn on the dictaphone, and, as if by magic, it loosened his tongue. His normal voice returned. I realized that the dictaphone, that simple, inoffensive mic, unwittingly suggested to him the idea of a police interrogation, as if in his eyes I'd become a Gestapo officer. Putting technology to one side, I went out and bought some school notebooks in which I would record our conversations during a whole year of interviews. Little by little our relationship changed from father and daughter to that of confidants. What struck me most in the course of our discussions was his feeling of being responsible for the lives of others and guilt at having survived. They are feelings he has retained throughout his life, and which doubtless explains why he continued to forge papers for 30 long years, at the cost of all sorts of sacrifices. For sacrifices there were, and many of them. Financial sacrifices, for, in order not to be a mercenary, he always refused payment for his forged papers, with the result that he was always broke. Sacrifices in his relationships, for his double life caused many breakups. His repeated unexplained absences made his partners think he wasn't truly involved, or was even being unfaithful, and eventually left him. Family sacrifices, since long before he married my mother, Layla, he had 2 grown-up children by an earlier marriage. I was very little and had just arrived in France when my father introduced me to my half-sister and half-brother. Unfortunately, he hadn't been able to bring up these earlier children, who were 30 years older than me, the way he would have liked. My sister told me that he once disappeared for 2 years, without sending any news, nor even saying goodbye. They often thought he was dead, sometimes that they'd been abandoned. They had no idea that his long silence was aimed at protecting them. Now I could better understand why my father didn't really like talking about the past, and I realized how fortunate I had been to have a dad who was there. The book, the culmination of many years of work, came out in France in 2009. In the meantime, I had returned to my work as an actress and scriptwriter. My father and I were happy and excited to see the book published, yet we were gradually overcome with a feeling of melancholy. For us, moving on from such a marvellous venture was like having to say goodbye. It was painful. We had become accustomed to our little rituals, had shared our secrets over the past few years, and what was going to happen now? I didn't know then, but a new story was about to begin, a story as rich and beautiful as the previous one. The book had a tremendous reception, which took us by surprise. It sold very quickly in the bookstores, and we were very much in demand with the press. There were laudatory portraits in the national and regional media, appearances on television and radio, reports on the TV news. I was asked to give a video-recorded talk on TEDx Paris, which also contributed to the great buzz the book created. There followed one translation into a foreign language after another: Italian, German, Spanish, Hebrew, Arabic, Turkish, and now English. We travelled around all those countries, met readers, booksellers, journalists. We haven't stopped spending time together, precious time, and the adventure of the book continues to this day. We regularly go to schools and colleges where my father speaks. That's what he prefers above all, passing on his knowledge. The first time he addressed 100 or so pupils of 16 to 17, he was very moved by their empathy and attention at an age when people are often unruly. You could have heard a pin drop in the hall. They were completely absorbed in the story he was telling them, asking astonishingly pertinent questions. On the way home, my father said, "Did you see how attentive they were? I'd never have thought young kids could be interested in an old dinosaur like me." I pointed out to him that those kids were exactly the same age as he'd been when he joined the resistance, which made it all the more easy for them to identify with him. During book signings and meetings with readers, quite a few people came along with old forged papers that had belonged to their parents or grandparents, to see if, by chance, they happened to have been made by my father. These people confided in us, hoping to discover some chapters of their own family history through ours. We listened to so many stories, met so many remarkable people, that there would be no point in even trying to go into them all here. Among the questions I was repeatedly asked, I have chosen one directly concerning the process of writing, which I would like to answer here. Why is the book written in the first person, as if my father were relating his own story, while I wrote it myself? In fact, I started the manuscript in the third person and in the past tense. But after having developed several chapters, I got stuck in the narrative, incapable of continuing. It wasn't the well-known writer's block, since I knew exactly what I wanted to write. I was paralyzed. For months on end, with no idea why, the very thought of sitting down at my computer made me feel ill. I decided to take a break and devote myself to other activities. The weeks passed, and I still couldn't find a solution to my problem. I was starting to have serious doubts about my ability to complete the project. That is, until the day I realized that talking about my father in the past tense was as good as writing his obituary in advance. So while he was there in front of me, very much alive, replying to my questions, I had the feeling I was pushing him into his grave. I had a revelation. I had to let him speak. I deleted all my work and started from the beginning again, using the first person, giving him a voice. On October 1st, 2015, my father turned 90. His life today, together with my mother, is a world away from the torments he suffered during his years underground. He's happy to be a husband, a father, and a grandfather, and particularly active for his age, for since the publication of the book he's started out on a new career. I've already mentioned the personal sacrifices he had to make. There is one that I've omitted. Refusing payment from the resistance networks that he served throughout his life, he made his living as a photographer in various fields, postcards, advertising photos, but also photo reportage on industry, the coal mines of the north, the French sugar refineries. He took numerous photographs of works of art for exhibition catalogues and posters as well, and he was the regular photographer for the painters who were the precursors of kinetic art, such as Antonio Assis, Jesus Soto, Carmelo Adonkin, Yakov Agam. As a specialist for giant-format photography, he produced photos for film sets for Trauner, the designer for Marcel Carnet, René Clair. Alongside this work he continued to take, for his own satisfaction, thousands of artistic photographs in the hope of exhibiting them one day. He developed the rolls of film and stored them in shoeboxes that he piled up on top of each other, without ever printing out the photos, because he had neither the time nor the financial means, so that no one has ever seen his work. Thousands of negatives hidden in boxes. What a waste! There are irreparable sacrifices, but this was not one of them, and it was perhaps not too late to start out on a career as a young photographer, even though he was over 80. He finally decided to print his photos and unveil his artistic work with, as his favourite subject, a view of the world in chiaroscuro, where the protagonists are workers, secret lovers, dealers in second-hand goods, real or pretended models, dislocated dolls, bearded hobos. From the flea market of Saint-Ouen to the neon lights of Pigalle, he has captured the looks, the solitary silhouettes, the lights, the elegance, and the fringes. Everything that goes to make up his universe. With the support of friends, we have arranged several exhibitions at cultural organizations and Parisian galleries. His unpublished photos have had a great success. It was extremely moving to see him talking about his photos with other photographers, recognized by his equals, of which he was the doyen, of course. Today my son is 12. When I was his age, while my friends' dads were reading them Grimm's fairy tales to get them to sleep, my father was telling me stories about very ordinary heroes. These unassuming heroes had such a strong belief in their ideals that they managed to realize them when it seemed impossible. These heroes had no army behind them. In general, they were just a handful of men and women of conviction and courage. At the time, I didn't know that it was his own story my father was telling me. I did, however, understand what he was trying to pass on to me through these part metaphorical, part biographical stories. They are the stories that I tell my son today to help him always believe in his dreams. Sarah Kaminsky, October 2015. Prologue. Since you want to know everything, Tell me what you think you know about my life. For example, when did you learn that I was in the resistance? To be honest, I don't know. Even less about you being a forger. If we'd stayed in Algeria, I might never have known about the Second World War. For me, you were the mujahid, as they say. But afterwards, in France, you knew? Not right away. You didn't talk to us about it. I grew up thinking I was the daughter of a social caseworker who helped rehabilitate young delinquents, found work for them, taught them photography. But by keeping my ears open when the grown-ups were talking, I got some hints, in bits and pieces. There were contradictions in what I learned. Everything was confused. It was through a series of external events that I came to understand. There was that article in Minute, the extreme right-wing weekly. You remember? Of course. I've even kept it. There, look. The ex-forger rebuilding his life on moral principles. Today, a former forger is keeping young people on the straight and narrow. This ex-member of the Janson network who supported the Algerian FLN against the French has now taken on the task of helping our delinquents from North Africa get back into society. Well, well. After this article appeared, some of the young people I was dealing with made jokes, in pretty poor taste, I have to say. I have a cousin who needs some papers, or I happen to need several thousand francs. I remember much later, when you were putting the file of material for our request for French citizenship together, I saw some letters. There was one that aroused my interest. It was an expression of gratitude for your work for the French Army Intelligence and Counterintelligence Services in 1945. I said to myself, wow, my father a secret agent. Depending on people's point of view, I heard you called a forger, a resistance hero, a traitor, a secret agent, an outlaw, a mujahid. And what did you think of all that? That one day I'd have to clear it up. Look, I've made a list of people I'd like to ask about you. Let me have a look. Hey, it's a long list you've got there. Your work's going to be complicated. They're almost all dead. When we'd finished, scoring out the names of all those I couldn't interview, my list had been reduced by half, and my father said, "That'll mean less work for you," making a joke, as he did every time painful subjects were broached. Death. Time. He'd just highlighted the reasons why I had to write this book, and quickly, before it was too late, so that he shouldn't pass away, taking his secrets, his story with him, so that the questions his life raised should not remain unanswered. It took me 2 years of research and some 20 interviews before I got to know Adolfo Kaminsky, who I only knew as Papa. Decoding his silences, detecting between the notes of his monotone delivery things he didn't put into words, understanding the parables and finding the messages hidden beneath the series of anecdotes that filled my notebook. And sometimes I needed to see the way other people looked at him to understand his choices, his life as a forger, his work underground, his political commitments, his inability to understand society and the hatred motivating various groups that encumbered it, his desire to build a world of justice and freedom. 1. Paris, January 1944. When I get to the entrance of the metro at Saint-Germain-des-Prés, I hurry down without wasting any time. I need to get to the eastern part of Paris, a train heading for Père-Lachaise. I choose a folding seat, keeping away from the other passengers. I have something precious in my attaché case, which I clutch to my chest. I tick off the stations mentally as they pass. République, only 3 to go. There's noise, voices coming from the next car. The train has been whistling for several seconds now, but the doors aren't closing. The sound of voices is replaced by footsteps, loud, sharp, very distinctive. I recognize them at once. A burning sensation sears my chest at the very moment a militia patrol, with their armbands and their berets pulled down tight over close-shaven heads, bursts into the car. A sign to the driver, and the doors close. "Identity check. Have all bags ready to be searched." I didn't look around at them. I wait my turn right at the end of the car. I've been used to police checks for ages now, but today I'm frightened. Keep calm. Conceal my emotions. Above all, they mustn't give me away. Not today. Not now. Stop my foot from tapping out the imaginary rhythm of a frenzied tune. Stop that drop of sweat from running down my forehead. Stop the blood from pounding through my veins. Slow down my heartbeat. Breathe slowly. Hide my fear. Stoical. Everything's fine. I have a mission to carry out. Nothing's impossible. Back there, just behind me, they're inspecting identity cards, rummaging through bags. I have to get off at the next stop. There's a militiaman guarding each door. It's obvious I have no chance of avoiding the check, so I get up and go, confidently, to show my papers to the militiaman who's making his way toward me, waving my hand to show that I have to get off soon. He reads the details on my card out loud. Julien Keller, 17, Dyer, born in Ain, Creuse département. He turns it over and over to examine it from all sides, looking up now and then to observe my reaction with his little suspicious eyes. I remain calm. I know he can't see how afraid I am. I also know, and I'm sure of it, that my papers are in order. I was the one who fabricated them. Papers in order. Keller. Is that Alsatian? Yes. And what have you got in there? That's exactly what I wanted to avoid. The militiaman points to the attaché case I'm holding, my hand clutching the handle nervously. For a brief moment I think I can feel the ground giving way beneath me. I'd like to take to my heels and clear off, but any attempt to flee would be futile. A wave of panic makes my blood run cold. I have to improvise, and do it quickly. "Are you deaf? What have you got in there?" the militiaman asks, raising his voice a little. "My sandwiches. Do you want to see them?" Suiting the action to the word, I open my attaché case. No problem. There are some sandwiches inside. They just have to conceal the things I have to hide at all costs. After a moment's hesitation, the militiaman gives me a hard look, scanning my face, searching for any weakness. So I give him my most inane smile, something I've always been able to do when necessary, to look very stupid. The following seconds seem like hours. We've reached Père-Lachaise station, and the train is whistling to indicate the doors are going to close. "Okay, you can go." I remember very well the shrill whistle of the wind over the graves in the cemetery. Sitting on a bench by one of the paths in the Père-Lachaise, I hadn't come to sit and meditate. My teeth were chattering, my body trembling. I'd had to get out of the metro and drag myself to the cemetery in order to find the solitude I needed to pull myself together again and allow the feelings I'd kept hidden beneath an apparent calm to resurface. I called that the retrospective shock, the body ridding itself of repressed emotions. I just had to wait patiently for my pulse to get back down to normal, for my hands to stop clenching, to relax. How long did it take? I don't know. 5 or 10 minutes, perhaps. Enough time for me to get cold and collect my thoughts. Enough time for me to remember why and for whom I was there, taking risks, and to remind myself how urgent the deliveries were that I was to make. It was this sense of urgency that finally pulled me out of my stupor in the oppressive silence of the cemetery, reminding me that I hadn't a minute to lose. No time to feel despair or self-pity, afraid or discouraged. I get ready to set off again. Before I get up, I open my attaché case, taking every precaution, for one final check. I lift up the sandwich. Everything's still there, my treasures. 50 blank French identity cards, my pen, my ink, my rubber stamp, and a stapler. On that day, as on so many others before, I knock at all the doors on a list I was given the previous day, and that I've spent the night learning by heart, the names and addresses of dozens of Jewish families who, according to what the network has learned thanks to sympathizers who've infiltrated the bureaucracy, are to be rounded up at dawn. I go up the boulevard de Ménilmontant, then take the rue des Courants to get to the alleys behind the boulevard de Belleville. Each time new faces are superimposed on these unknown names. Rue de Moulin-Joly, the Blumenthal family. Maurice, Lucie, and their children Jean, Eliane, and Vera. Having taken the forged papers, now their life underground is beginning. In the best cases, they already have passport photos. I just have to staple them to the blank identity cards, then carefully fill them out in the handwriting of a City Hall clerk. Sometimes they're happy to take the forged papers, but haven't got the necessary materials needed to complete them on the spot. Nevertheless, they take my visit seriously and assure me they won't be at home the next day at the time the roundup is to take place. Some have an uncle, a girlfriend, a cousin where they can hide. Others have no one. There are some who refuse at first, then change their minds when I assure them it's a free offer. But unfortunately, not everyone is so easy to convince. That evening, for example, there was Madame Drode, Rue Oberkampf, a widow who astounded me by her lack of awareness, her obstinate insistence about seeing me as someone dishonest. When I offered her the papers, she was offended. Why should I hide? I who've done nothing, who've been French for several generations. I had time to see, over her shoulder, the table set in the parlour with 4 children around it, quietly eating their supper. I did everything I could to try and convince her. I explained that my network made it their business to hide children. They would be in an absolutely secure place with decent people out in the country, and she would even get news of them. Begging her got me nowhere. She simply wasn't listening, didn't want to hear what I was saying, just stood there looking indignant. What really struck me was that after having listened to me telling her what I'd seen with my own eyes when I was interned in Drancy, the thousands of deportees, whole trainloads being sent to their death, she coldly replied that the death camps didn't exist, that she didn't believe the lies of Anglo-American propaganda. Then, after pausing for a second, she became threatening and warned me that if I didn't leave immediately she would call the police. Had she not realized that the police, the ones who would come to arrest her and her children in the morning, would not be coming to protect them? With my case and my sorrow as a double burden, I continued on my way, from door to door, counting and making lists in my head, the future clandestine Jews on the one hand, the deportees on the other. I knew already that I would always remember the latter, that I would never be entirely able to erase their names, their faces, from my memory, that I would have nightmares about them. Well aware that I was perhaps the last witness of their freedom, I tried to make a little space for them in my memories. It was no use hurrying. The glacial darkness of winter nights had finally swept away the clear February sun. After the last door of the last address had closed behind me, it was long past the time of the curfew. I had to turn into a shadow, hug the walls, avoid the light of the street lamps, muffle my steps, glide over the ground and disappear. But above all, I had to find a telephone booth to let my contact know I'd finished my sector, dial a number, leave a coded message, and only then could I go home. After 20 minutes of walking anxiously, I finally saw in the distance the outlines of the brick building of the Young Men's Hostel, nowadays the Women's Refuge. At that time it was a hostel for students and young workers. It was very cheap, and I lodged there until I could find something better. When I got to the barred entrance, I rang the bell several times, but no one came to open up. I was cold. My feet were frozen, and I was locked out during the curfew. Everywhere in the darkness I thought I could see threatening silhouettes, shadows, hear voices. I felt I was in danger, nowhere to go. Exhausted, having rung the bell one last time, though without deluding myself that anyone might come, I went to hide in the entrance to an apartment block, sitting on a step, hunched up, arms wrapped around me, waiting for daybreak. Unable to get a wink of sleep, startled by every gust of wind, I thought back to Madame Drode, to all those I hadn't managed to convince, to the children especially. I felt guilty without being able to say of what. I regretted not having been able to find the right words, convincing arguments. I wanted to continue to believe that my efforts, like those of my comrades, had not been in vain. Never give up. I wondered whether Otter had managed to finish his round before the curfew, whether he'd been able to hand out more papers than me. I hoped he hadn't been arrested, for if he had, it meant he was already dead. It was January, 1944. Contrary to what it said on my papers, I wasn't 17. I just turned 18. I've made myself a year younger.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?